introduction for that.
That's great. Sounds good.
Okay. Yes, so welcome to Jennifer Tierney, our guest, who would have been our guest speaker in Sydney for the event there, but through various circumstances, we're now talking to Jennifer, as we so easily got used to over the last 2 years via Zoom, online via Zoom. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's all right. So first up, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm on. I'm in Melbourne, so the traditional custodians of my land are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and just pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So Jennifer, you have a very interesting career. You're the executive director for Médecins Sans Frontières in Australia, for MSF
Yes.
in Australia. And during your first 12 months of that, you led the development on a new strategic plan with a focus on the intersection of humanitarian work with climate change, which we'll come to discuss. I found that very interesting, but also diversity, equity, and the inclusion in the humanitarian sector. And obviously being MSF, patient-centred care, obviously to do with medical needs and medicine. You've also, obviously, over the last couple of years, it's been, for anyone working in the health and medical sector, it's been a trying time working through COVID-19 and the pandemic, looking at equitable healthcare wherever that may be, but certainly in developing countries. Before MSF, you were the Director of Fundraising and Comms, Communication, which is my area, with UNICEF. So that's good. UNICEF's great, UNICEF Australia, working as the Senior Director at Synergos. Is it Synergos or Synergos?
Synergos.
Synergos, sorry, beg my pardon. Synergos, leading their comms and fundraising projects, and a strategic consultant with organisations including Amnesty International, Orbis, Concern Worldwide, and the Clinton Foundation, which is fairly impressive. So, there's the whole screed I could talk to you about in terms of what you've done. I guess to leave you something to reply with for our viewers, as it were. Oops, sorry, I'm losing my earpiece. I just wanted to kick it off by asking you to give an overview, I guess, of how you've moved through your career. As I said, from working in programs, hands-on in programs, on the ground, through to marketing and comms, then moving into strategic planning, etc. And now, obviously, in a more leadership-based role. If you could give us an idea of what that pathway has been like for you and how that came about for you.
Yeah, I won't bore you with my entire life story, but I grew up in a smallish town, medium-sized town in Connecticut in the US. And so my exposure to international anything was very limited until I was in university. Left the country twice until I was about 20 years old. And then I went to study abroad in Thailand, shocking my parents and not going to France along with all of my other colleagues. And I ended up having the great fortune of working with WEAVE, which is a small refugee support organization that works on the economic development for women on the Thai-Burmese border. It was a fantastic experience. And whenever I think any person who's worked for a small NGO knows, they will have you doing all sorts of things that you might not actually have a complete skill set for. But very quickly, I realized that I could really apply skills of writing and fundraising to them, and then parlayed that into my career. During that time, though, I went to the Thai-Burmese border and met these two physicians who were working on resistance to malaria drugs on the Thai-Burmese border. And they happened to be from this organization called Médecins Sans Frontières, which was very nascent in the US. They had just opened a couple of years prior. So I didn't know them well. I'd heard vaguely of them, but they were irreverent and funny and determined and smart. And I was just like, well, that's it. That's what I want to do. And I didn't really mean for MSF necessarily, but I meant I really want to be in this space.
Yeah.
So having very little international exposure, no second language, I just thought to myself, what's useful? Like, how am I going to be most useful to people? And so that's why I chose the path of fundraising and eventually communications, because everybody needs money, right? And so it was a very pragmatic I've always been very pragmatic, in my approach to things. So I started with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which was an amazing place to work for, with an absolutely inspirational executive director who I still look to for inspiration and leadership. Had a great experience there. Took some time off to figure out how to get into the international sector. Worked for FINCA, which is a microfinance organization, for quite some time. Transferred to MSF after that, after developing a pretty strong skill set of fundraising and in marketing and major gifts, et cetera, et cetera. And then at MSF, I worked as a marketing director, and then I quit. And I said, I want to work in the field. And they said, that's fine, you can apply. Even, though I worked very typical MSF, yeah. I'd worked there and was a complete known entity, but I went through the competitive process. I took a big risk in leaving my very, well, you're never going to get rich working for MSF, that's for sure, but it was at least a secure paycheck. Yeah. And then they said, but wait, the fundraising director just quit, and we really want to see you put your hat in the ring for that role. Again, not a guarantee, but you can go into the competitive process. And I got that role, and I said, I'm fine to take this as long as you let me spend my summers doing gap fills in the field. So that's how I ended up mixing field work with fundraising work. So I ended up working in South Sudan as a project coordinator, and then in Lebanon for the Syria project. Came over to Australia after having some kids with my partner, and who's also MSF, and so knows the craziness of this world, and went to UNICEF, and here I am.
Sorry, I like to mute so that I don't disturb you with any background noise, and I always forget to turn it off.
No problem.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing pathway, and it pretty much underlines often what we tell the people who join us at events, but also I teach in the international development space, and often what I say to my students is exactly what you said, is that it's the type of space where you might have a certain skill set, or you might be developing initially, early career, a certain skill set. But wherever you work, no matter which organization you work for, you'll never just be asked to do something that applies only to that skill set. You will have to learn on the job or on the run, and that you will have, you wear 5 hats. You basically have to put your hand to everything, because it's just that type of sector, which is actually very good in a lot of ways, because it makes you think on your feet, and it really does get you to learn a lot about the overall process of how organisations work and how the development sector works itself. So yeah, I think it's interesting that, like you say, in highlighting those elements of your career path, that's the message that comes out too, is the opportunities that came up and what you had to do to get the work done, get the jobs done, and and out of that came those opportunities.
Yeah, and I think it was really important to prove that I was useful. I think it sounds a bit silly, but in that MSF marketing job, I showed up for all the program briefings. People knew I was really engaged with the program material, that I really cared about the topic that we were discussing, and it wasn't just about the marketing elements. You can make that mark, just by being really engaged and having the passion for a mission. I taught at NYU on philanthropy and fundraising for a bit, and I used to tell the students, they would say, oh, I'm going to go for a master's in fundraising, et cetera. And I said, listen, you're going to be much more competitive if you combine that with on-the-job experience, because the nonprofit sector really is often looking for people who can come right in and get going. So the more that you can do in internships or whatever while you're studying, it's just going to make you that much more employable.
Yeah. And I was interested in, you said one of the early organizations you worked for, it was a CEO or the boss of that one, was someone that you're still had a big impact on you, and someone you're still in contact with. So do you think it's important to find a mentoring figure in this sector and in the roles you've been doing? If you take on a significant role, do you think a mentor type person is essential, if not a very good idea?
I think the more responsibility you take on, it's important at every stage, but for me, I am so grateful for my mentor who I have now. She is just an amazing woman, and it's been absolutely essential. And you need somebody who can speak truth to you, you know, and really be honest with you about the areas where you need to focus on to improve. You know, they say feedback is a gift, but it's often hard to take on board. But when you have a trusting relationship with a mentor, they'll tell you things that others won't. You know, that first woman, Iris Gleason at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, I was 25 years old in that role. And I had anyway, I was with a group at an event, and someone was injured, and it was a long story, and I took care of that at quite a young age. And the family of the injured person had some fairly direct feedback. Now, whether it was valid or not, but the fact that she sat down and said to me, listen, the way that she framed that for me was so important, right? Like, you have done a great job around all of these areas. I want to talk to you about an area where you know, your communication skills could improve when dealing with stakeholders, whatever it was. And I will never forget it. I'm just so grateful to her for being sensitive and honest and delivering that information in a way that I could receive and grow. And I'm always, you know, looking for people, and it just so happens most of them have been women, but men too, who can provide me with that very kind service, really.
And it's really very much a skill, being able to do that, like you say, without offering offense, without putting someone off, to deliver that sort of, you know, critiquing, that sort of feedback is very much a skill. So do you find now in a leadership role that that's something that you think you do well because of the mentor you had, or that you are able to do or need to do fairly often with people under you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, my mentor now has said to me, well, first there was an HR person I'll never forget. She worked in the nonprofit sector, and she said, nonprofit folks are kind to one person at the expense of everyone around them, because they avoid giving tough feedback to people who aren't either performing at their best or their behaviors aren't quite right. So nonprofit sector can be so nice, it over indexes into avoidance. So as Claire, my mentor, put it to me, you know, fairly recently in the last year and a half or so, that's actually unkind. It's unkind to avoid those conversations because it's difficult for you. So the kind thing to do is to step into those discussions, but give them real thought and be, you know, be careful and supportive of the person in developing their skills. So I think it's absolutely essential. And I think it allows you the opportunity to develop trust with your colleagues as well. They know that they're not going to get baloney from me. You know, they know that. And I just had some 360 feedback, and the one line that I was actually, I'm not always very pleased because I'm quite tough on myself, but one line said, you know that what she's saying to us in a crowd is what she's saying behind closed doors as well. And for me, that is just so essential. And it really is Iris and Claire and the other women who have really given me the skills to be able to do that.
Yeah, and very valuable, especially in a career, like when you in your daily work, but also in terms of knowing where your strengths and weaknesses lie. Yeah. That's really, really important in your own development, working in this particular sector. I mean, I suppose it applies to any sector, any business you work in, but very much necessary in the development sector. I'd like to touch on something I mentioned, like in the introduction. As I said, you've worked in the area where you worked at the intersection of humanitarian work and climate change. How does that work? It's an interesting combination. Obviously, climate change has moved up the ladder as being one of the key issues that the development sector now addresses, along with education and gender and health. But climate change is very much a major issue in terms of the programs, the projects, the fundings, everything that's going on in the development sector. So what exactly, explain the intersection between humanitarian work and climate change?
Well, I think the answer is evolving, right? And we are really in the early throes of discussion around this at MSF. I mean, when I came in 2.5 years ago, there was a lot of discussion around mitigation. So us lowering our carbon footprint, just starting to put in the measurements to be able to track our progress, both as a local, organization in Australia and internationally. And then started to get into information sharing between offices, best practices, that type of thing. And the conversation around operations was still evolving. Folks were saying, okay, well, MSF responds to disasters, and climate is another disaster. And so we just need to be able to respond to it as opposed to necessarily advocating. Others were saying, no, that's not right, because we advocate for the best healthcare for our patients. So we actually need to advocate around climate too, because it's having a major impact on their health, whether that be through the exacerbation of transmission of disease or drought affected areas, which create malnutrition crises, flooding in the Pacific, so we're now at that stage. And our office is contributing to the movement by creating learning and development curriculums for folks on the ground so that they can identify how climate is actually going to impact their projects for now and into the future. And so it's been quick, and it's been, which is great. It's been a real shift quite fast, and I'm really happy that we're at the cusp of it.
It is a really interesting combination, isn't it? Because if you say, for people who have heard of, and most people should have, especially in the development sector, MSF, Médecins, Sans Frontières, you think of, doctors, like you say, in disaster zones, medical tents and like you say, health issues, addressing health issues, and that it doesn't directly relate in your thinking to climate change. So it's an interesting path for MSF to have gone down.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things that we were saying is we have to be better about how we treat waste and carbon emissions for our communities, right? Yeah. So with health and with medical care, the mantra is first do no harm. So we needed to at least take that on board as sort of a floor, a minimum. So waste disposal, reducing carbon through flight, transport of cargo and putting them onto boats, local sourcing so that we can reduce carbon footprint, reusables in the field, so not constantly using plastics that we have to dispose of, disposing of bio-waste in appropriate ways for the settings. Like those are all contributory to deterioration of the planet if we're not careful. So that was the baseline, and then it goes to the second conversation around how is actual climate acceleration affecting patients, and how do we prepare for that as an organization, and how do we respond to it now?
Yeah, no, like you say, it's not, like I was saying, it's not really obvious, but when you say it, when you lay it out like that, you think, well, it is like any organization, is that we all have a carbon footprint and we've all got to be careful with what we're doing, but you're doing it in areas that really can little afford any carbon footprint.
That's right.
And are being affected by that carbon footprint. So yeah.
But you're completely right that I don't think it didn't feel immediately obvious to everyone in MSF either. More and more so as we articulate, all of this, but yeah, it took a little while to come to that really clear logic.
Yeah. So in terms of MSF as we traditionally know it, working in, like I say, conflict zones, disaster zones, that's obviously still the key part of what you do. How are you finding it in this current, not to use a pun, but current climate, this current era of development internationally? How are you finding that working? Is MSF, it's been around for a while now, so obviously how is it still going with conflict zones, especially, I guess, that work, whether it's about the security, a lot of the issues that have been raised now in conflict zones are about medical, especially medical teams, and that having difficulty with security because they're no longer protected by, a big red cross on the tent or saying these are medical people, and there's not like I wouldn't call it a gentleman's agreement, but there's that understanding that perhaps used to once exist about you need to leave the medical situation alone in any hotspot, be it a natural disaster, be it especially conflict zones. How is MSF catering for that now? I don't know if there's been a drop-off in staff, in personnel, the response to MSF in terms of how it's still faring as a proactive and advocating good health, but a proactive entity on the ground in sort of humanitarian situations.
Yeah, actually, I was in a discussion on this last night, so it's quite fresh in my mind. And we were looking at some of the statistics of security incidents, in particular in conflict. And as one of the speakers put it, there was no golden era, and there has been no golden era for MSF. So while the rhetoric might have changed, there was always security challenges for us. We have seen spikes in some years. I mean, particularly after the incident in Dashtabashi in Afghanistan, which was the tragic murder of our patients and newborn babies and staff, midwives in a hospital setting. There are moments like that that are absolutely horrific, which will continue to occur. But I think one of the things that's sadly, and which we mitigate by continuing to do what we've always done, which is appealing to both sides of a conflict, providing healthcare to both sides of the conflict. But it's not always going to work. So we always have to have that measured discussion very much at the local level in the unique circumstances in which we are working about whether or not it makes sense to maintain presence in the country, because we always have to balance duty of care to our staff versus, access and support of our patients. Obviously they're not always in complete contrast with one another. So maybe versus is the wrong word, but there are two elements that we have to constantly be looking out for. In Afghanistan, for instance, we continue to work at the same volume that we did pre the Taliban takeover.
Wow.
We're a known entity in Afghanistan. We have strong contacts in the local areas in which we work. So we're still treating thousands of patients doing trauma, doing maternal health care, responding to COVID. So there's a lot that we are able to do in that context. In other contexts, more challenging to get access to, to areas where our presence is not as well known, we might not be established, and where the power dynamics or there's shifting power with multiple groups in different contexts that make it more difficult for us to get clear visibility on what the risks actually are. The bottom line is that it's going to be our engagement with the local community and our engagement with our locally hired team members that is often going to provide us with the best information and understanding of the context and drive a lot of the decisions around security.
I imagine you've got obviously a good strategic plan or program, will have been easily in place for a long time. But is it hard getting, depending on what area you're going into, whether it's severe conflict, whether it's an ongoing conflict, whether it's a humanitarian crisis, is it hard getting local community members on the ground to work with you? Do you need to train them? For the most part, are you looking for actual people who are already knowledgeable or trained for what the jobs you need them to do on the ground? How does that work?
Yeah, it's completely different in each context. So for instance, in some countries we'll be invited by the Ministry of Health because there's a particular issue that they want us to support on, particularly around COVID, right? Where health systems were really stretched. We might receive an open arms and an invitation. In some instances, it takes time to develop relationships, and you have to show up and prove yourself in small ways before trust is developed, and before folks understand what your value add can actually be to the situation. And so it really just depends on, where we are, what the context of the environment is. It just doesn't happen in one way. And throughout a country, of course, there can be many different regions with different political dynamics or security dynamics. And so it's different in each of those areas. So you've got a head of mission who's overseeing, each of those different access challenges.
So given the dynamics of working for an organisation like MSF, and like we say, mostly obviously in the humanitarian sector, more than as well as the development sector, but in those crises areas of conflict and responding to disasters and that, what would your advice be for, let's say, for young women, for young development workers, but obviously in our case, for our purposes, for young women, especially in their early career development, in terms of if they want to move into both the development, but especially in your case, the humanitarian sector, what would be your advice to them in terms of the type of thing they're looking at, especially in this day and age, in going into a career in the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on what you want to do at the end of the day. If you want to, so for me, I knew that if I ever wanted to lead an MSF office, I would have to have experience working in the field. There are, I'm sure, some exceptions to that rule, but it would have been a much more viable for me to lead this organization having done the work. That's tough, right? At times, like I was willing to quit my job and go for 9 months. And the fact that I even did that demonstrated that I was completely dedicated to the mission, even though I didn't end up going for 9 months. But I think you have to be willing to step out of, I wouldn't say comfortable life, because sometimes the field is really good, and not comfortable in luxury, but you're focused on one thing. You've got one mission. You don't have 5,000 competing demands around you. It allows you to just focus on your work, says a mother of a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, after surviving not finding the right hat for Disney Day this morning. So, I think if you want a role in program or leadership, you're going to have to take the time out and go do that work. Now, whether that's with family, etc. If your ambition is to be a head of fundraising or something that doesn't necessarily require that work on the ground, then I think it's about networking and demonstrating interest in the topic, really. Reaching out to somebody like myself. I mean, I'm happy to have a conversation with folks. I'm sure lots of people are, about what potential next steps might be, or how to position yourself to be a strong candidate in this space.
Okay. All right, we might wrap it up there, Jennifer. Jennifer Tierney, thank you so much for your time today. Like I say, I'm sorry you didn't get a chance to be in person with Chris and the group in Sydney, but it was really good to have the opportunity to talk to you today and be able to put that up on our social media network. So thank you very much for your time, and it's been a really interesting chat.
Thanks, Jill.